Tangata whenua o Tamaki Makoto. No mai hara mai ki te whare tawahi a mahi Aotearoa ko Hamish McDougall taku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Greetings. As the National Executive Director of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, it's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening, including our members of the NZIIA, the Consular and Diplomatic Corps, all other guests. Very warm welcome to you all. Nau mai, hara mai. Thanks for coming along in good numbers. We've had to put the sold out signs up tonight for this event, and also for the event on Wednesday evening in Wellington, also featuring Professor Hugh White. I think there's significant interest for a couple of reasons. One is that Professor White's excellent reputation, I think, on this side of the Tasman really precedes him. I was looking into our records, and he's spoken at the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs a number of times, including the original annual lecture in 2002, 22 years ago. Been very interesting times in the lead up to the Iraq War. The Right Honourable Helen Clark would have been Prime Minister at that time. Dr. Don Brash would have just stepped down as the Governor of the Reserve Bank and become a National Party MP. As I understand it, the gist of that talk was to sort of understand that Australia and New Zealand have different interests and different perceptions in establishing their defence policy, and that both sides need to sort of understand those different interests and perceptions. It'll be interesting to explore a little bit perhaps whether the same applies today to a greater or lesser extent. But of course the second reason that there's so much interest in what Hugh is talking about this evening is we're having a slightly rare thing, I think, in New Zealand at the moment, and that we're having a forthright and high-profile public debate on foreign defence and security policy. And this is particularly focused on the question of New Zealand's involvement in the AUKUS security partnership, in particular the sharing of advanced military technologies known as AUKUS Pillar 2 with the other partners, the United States, UK and Australia. Now, as an independent non-government organisation, NZIIA doesn't take a view on such things, but we do, I would argue, play a really important role in encouraging public understanding and discussion of the issues and bringing expert views to bear on those issues. And this is part of a really long-running conversation that we're having here at the Institute. We hold over 80 events a year from a really wide range of perspectives, and even this week, on Thursday evening, we've got another talk from Dr. Ruben Steff, who I suspect will give a diametrically opposite view than you might hear here tonight. But it just goes to show that we are doing our best to try and cover these issues from a wide range of points of view. Professor Hugh White's expertise has been honed over several decades, I think, working in strategic and defence policy, Asia-Pacific security issues and global strategic affairs. He's Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the Australian National University and a former senior Australian defence official and advisor to Kim Beazley and Bob Hawke. And he's also the first director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and a prolific writer, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, of books and articles, among the latest of which is How to Defend Australia. So we're shortly going to ask Hugh to talk for about 20 minutes to the topic at hand, and then after Hugh, we'll have some discussion points made by Professor Ruben Azizian. Ruben will be familiar to most of you as the chair of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs Auckland branch, and an expert in security studies and international relations, not least as a former director of the Centre for Defence and Security Studies at Massey University. So the topic tonight is very much in his wheelhouse, so we'll ask Ruben to talk for about 10 minutes following Hugh, and then we should have a good half an hour or so for some good questions and discussions. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Hugh White. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamish, for that introduction, and indeed for you and your team for bringing us together here this evening. I also want to thank Don Brash and Helen Clark, who have been kind enough to invite me here and help to put together some opportunities for me to talk to New Zealand audiences about these issues, and very nice for everyone to share the platform with you as well this evening. As Hamish said, it's not my first gig with the NZIIA, nor my first exposure to New Zealand's debates on strategic and defence policy. There are always tendency, in Australia at least, to presume on the many similarities between Australia and New Zealand, to think that in the end New Zealanders do or should see things on the security front just the same way Australians do, and they're always a bit surprised when that turns out not to be the case. For me, it's always been clear that notwithstanding all the similarities, the differences, amongst other things, just in history and geography, mean that there are significant differences between and there always have been significant differences between our approach to these questions. And that's why I've always been very interested in getting back here as often as I can and trying to immerse myself, or at least dip into your conversations about these questions as a compare and contrast to what's going on in Australia. And that's what I'm here to try and do at the moment, but also to sing to myself, to offer some thoughts of my own about the choices we face. Now, I'm not going to give you a lecture about whether or not New Zealand should sign up to Pillar 2 per se. What I want to do is to talk about the bigger issues that seems to me would be worth considering in framing your national debate about that question, and in the process, of course, make some reflections on where Australia's coming from. Because those bigger issues, the bigger issues that should frame that debate, are very big indeed. I think the big thought I have to offer you is that the choices that both countries face about AUKUS are really just, if you like, a subordinate part, a token in some ways, or a symbol of a much bigger set of choices we have to make about how we respond to what is, I think, much unquestionably, the biggest shift in our international environment. When I say our, I mean Australia's and New Zealand's shared international environment since European settlement of our respective countries. And that's a big subject in itself, but to give you the shorthand version, that shift is the emergence of Asian powers comparable in strength to those of the Western great powers which have dominated and framed Asia for so long. And I say great powers plural because, of course, it's a China story, but it's not just a China story. It's India and eventually, potentially, pretty certainly, Indonesia. Indonesia will be, well before the middle of the century, it'll be the fourth biggest economy in the world. And, you know, the economics is at the heart of this, because what's driven the emergence of those great powers is, of course, a really, truly epochal shift in distribution of wealth and power. The whole phenomenon we call the rise of China is the biggest shift in that distribution, biggest and fastest shift in that distribution in history. And that shift, the emergence of those stronger great powers, the result, challenge the old international order in Asia based on Western preeminence, which has framed our respective histories as countries in this part of the world, and of course framed it very much to our advantage. We've been established as Western outposts in this part of the world, and our existence there has been nurtured and supported and at times, stressful times, defended by that Western power. And that era, I'm here to tell you, is coming to an end. And that's a huge shift, which I think our respective countries, certainly, I can't speak for you guys, I can speak for Australians, we haven't come to terms with it yet. And the debates we have about AUKUS is, to me, just a kind of a subset, but as it often happens, a small thing, I think in the end AUKUS is a small thing, becomes a proxy for a much, much bigger debate. And how big? Well, at one level you could say that the end of the era of Western preeminence is a reflection of the end of the Cold War. or the end of the post-Cold War order based on sort of US global primacy. But it is really much more than that, because it really does undermine that Western preeminence which has framed the international order in Asia, at least since the beginning of the 19th century, and in some ways arguably back to Vasco da Gama. And we have tended to regard the maintenance of that order as a necessary and sufficient condition for our security. You could say, for Australia at least, that the primary motive of Australian foreign and strategic policy ever since we started to think about such things in the late 19th century was to do whatever we can to sustain Western primacy, and particularly British and then American primacy in the region. And today, primacy, that leadership faces the most severe challenge it's ever faced. And we have to work out what we do about it. And it is, to put it mildly, absolutely vital to our country's futures that we handle this challenge well. So, what are the possibilities? What kind of end states might we see as the order in Asia changes in the light of the emergence of these great powers? Well, let me list three. I mean, there are probably an infinite number, but I think we can frame the discussion around three options. One, which would be the ideal outcome, at least to me, will be somehow a miraculous preservation of the status quo, a preservation of American power as a defining foundation of the Asian order. But in order for that to be a durable, sustainable proposition, it would, that American role would have to be accepted by China and India and eventually Indonesia over the long term. And I think the chance of that happening is virtually zero. So, nice idea, don't bet on that one. The second best outcome would be for the US to stay engaged in Asia, not as a leading power, but as a balancing power. And that will be a region, an order in which America can dominate the way it has in the past. It would just be one of the gang, but it would be one of the gang, and it would be one of the gang that could impose some limits and constraints on what China, and for that matter other great powers, did. And that's if we can't have the ideal, that wouldn't be bad. It's the second best outcome. And the third outcome, the scary option, is the one in which the United States doesn't sort of half withdraw like that, doesn't really withdraw, leaves the region and leaves China and India essentially to take its place as the region's leading powers. Now, a lot of us find the idea of Asia without American presence almost unthinkable, certainly in Canberra. I think a lot of people find it kind of literally, very intelligent and sophisticated people, literally cannot imagine it. And that's because, of course, America's been around for a long time. But it can happen. I mean, big changes do happen every so often, and we're on the cusp, I think, of one of them. So, how's the process which leads to one or other of those outcomes unfold? Well, it's a big subject in itself, and of course, can be very complex. I'm going to simplify by focusing on what is the key dynamic at the moment, and will I think remain a key dynamic for quite some time, and that is the US-China rivalry. Because right at the heart of the US-China rivalry is, of course, a fundamental, stark disagreement on what should happen. China's aim is essentially the scary option. China's aim, I believe, is to establish itself as the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, not necessarily in Asia as a whole, but in East Asia and the Western Pacific, and take America's place and see America lead. And America's aim, it's hard to say what America's aim is actually at the moment, particularly between now and the first Tuesday in November. So let me just pick on the poor old Democrats. We know where they're coming from, at least. The Democrats' aim, and some Republicans' aim, is to preserve the status quo, is my ideal option. To preserve US leadership as the foundation for the Asian order, and instead to make no substantial concessions to China at all. Now, just to be clear, there are some people in the US debate who talk as if they're looking for my second best option, balancing power option. I think because they realise that the sustaining US primacy doesn't sound very credible. But I see no evidence in their discussions of this that they are really serious about building a new order based on partnership or sharing with China. And one reason for that is that they find it, I think, simply impossible to understand what it would be like to treat China as an equal partner, which is what you would absolutely have to do to make that model viable. And so although there's some talk about balance, really I think the heart of the Biden administration's, and for that matter the Obama administration for its policy, was to assert primacy and preserve the status quo indefinitely into the future. And just, one footnote on the Republicans. Well, the confusion about the Republicans is that there's a lot of opinions there, ranging on the one hand from regime change in Beijing, assuming we can arrange it. I mean, don't laugh, that's what Matt Pottinger's recent article in Foreign Affairs was all about. And he was Trump's China guy in the last Trump administration. So, red meat Republicans on the one hand, who, would out Ronald Reagan, all the way through on the other hand to Donald Trump, who I think is a genuine dyed-in-the-wall isolationist. He genuinely doesn't buy the idea of US leadership. And what would happen? Well, nobody knows. For a reason I'll touch on later, I don't think in the end it matters very much which of the two. And in this respect, it matters very greatly in other respects. On this particular issue, I don't think it matters very much which of them end up being elected. But it is worth just making the point that the uncertainty on the Republican side is an intriguing feature of the situation. So that's what China and America think. What about the rest of the region? Well, I think it's pretty clear that with the possible exception of Japan, which is a very interesting, important and complex case, the region would like the second option. They're not particularly fussed about America remaining the dominant power in the region. They don't have the same sort of stake in that Australia does, for example. But if that's not going to be possible without escalating strategic rivalry between the US and China, and it's not, then they go for option number two. They'd like America to stick around, but they want it to stick around to balance and share power with China, not to dominate. And if that's not possible, they'd rather see America leave than to see it compete with China in a way that raises the risk of escalating rivalry and conflict. So a big question then is, well, will the US succeed in achieving its objective? And I think, to cover a big issue quickly, it's very unlikely that it will, and its attempt to do so is very dangerous. It's unlikely that it will, not just because Donald Trump's a bit weird, or even that the Democrats are a bit incompetent, which I think they are, but something much more fundamental, and that is the costs and risks to America of imposing the kind of pressure that would be necessary for them to impose on China in order to force the Chinese back off their objective and accept America's preferred outcome, which would be American primacy. The costs and risks of that would be very high and would exceed the imperatives the United States have to do so. Now let me just talk about the costs and risks first and then to talk about the imperatives. The costs, containing China would require a massive effort, not just because China is the first country since the Americans overtook the British to have an economy the same size as America, and not just an economy, of course, a deep and ever deepening technological base and very formidable military capabilities, including, very critically, air and maritime military capabilities and increasingly nuclear forces. But also because it's an asymmetrical contest in which China holds all the advantages. In particular, it holds the advantage of being a local power. It's all different in the world between China trying to stop America trying to stop the Chinese intruding into the Western Hemisphere. America will win that one. But for in China, there are a lot of asymmetrical advantages in preventing the Americans from being able to project and sustain power right across the wide Pacific. And for all the talk we've seen out of Washington over the last, 15 years in some ways, and very much over the last 5 years about their determination to push back against China, they have not done nearly enough to put themselves in a position to contest China's challenge effectively. So just to take one very crude measure, their military capability relative to China's has declined as America's military capability has stayed flat and China's has increased very sharply. So their position relative to China militarily has gone backwards. And that's reflected in a crude but I think vivid way in what's happened to their GDP share. The last time America took on a really formidable peer competitor, the Soviet Union, it spent in the 50s 10% or 9% of GDP on defence. And it never went below 6% the whole way through the Cold War, even right towards the end when things were getting easy. But now they're spending 3.5% with no serious sign of it increasing. And so there's been no substantial increase in the US military position in the Western Pacific to answer China's rise. So their position has deteriorated very significantly. And that's a symptom of the fact that America is, although it likes the idea of preserving primacy in Asia, it's not willing to pay the costs that are going to be required to do so. Likewise, it's a question of bearing the risks, because embedded in all of this, of course, is the possibility of conflict. And central to America's capacity to preserve its position is to persuade the Chinese that it's willing to fight a war against China in order to do so, whether Taiwan or something else. Now, China is a nuclear power, and any war with China carries a risk, I would say actually a high risk, but even if it's not very high risk, it's still very significant, of becoming a nuclear war. So one clear sign we should be looking for is whether America clearly acknowledges and accepts the risk of fighting a nuclear war with China. And here again, the contrast with the Cold War is very stark. During the Cold War, US political leaders were absolutely explicit that in order to do the key things they needed to do, like defend Berlin or West Berlin from the Soviets, they were prepared to fight a nuclear war, which they understood and acknowledged the American people would easily involve attacks on American cities. American political leaders today just don't acknowledge that in relation to the conflict on China, to a conflict with China, which suggests to me that if they don't acknowledge it, they don't accept it. And I think the Chinese understand that. Now, there's a reason why America is not prepared to accept those costs and risks the way they were during the Cold War, or, for example, in fighting the Second World War. And that is the imperative is not there. This is a long and complex issue, but right at the heart of America's decisions to abandon isolationism and engage in a world so vividly as they did for much of the 20th century was the fear that a single country would come and dominate the whole of Eurasia, which the Soviet Union, for example, certainly threatened to do, had the capacity to do at the beginning of the Cold War. And the reason for that was that any country that dominated the whole of Eurasia, and only a country that dominated the whole of Eurasia, would have the capacity to threaten the United States at home in the Western Hemisphere. Now, I don't think China has any chance of dominating Eurasia. It's going to be very strong, but it's going to be surrounded by very strong powers. It's going to have India, it's going to have Russia, it's going to have Europe, and it's not going to be without challenges, potential challenges in East Asia like Japan. So I think the chances of China dominating Eurasia are very low. Therefore, the imperatives for the United States to prevent it dominating East Asia are very low and too low to justify the costs and risks of a really muscular containment strategy. So that's why I think in the long run, the US is unlikely to succeed. I also think the policy they're adopting is very dangerous. And it's dangerous because the contest is essentially military. When the stakes are so high, although other aspects of competition, even economic competition and diplomatic competition and so on are there, right at the heart of it, this is essentially a military contest. Not because either side wants, let alone intends, war, but each side wants to use the threat of war to make their rival back off. And this is really what Taiwan is all about. The tension over Taiwan, military tension over Taiwan, is not just about Taiwan. It's not that Taiwan its own destiny is irrelevant, of course, it's quite an important issue. But neither America nor China will go to war with the other over Taiwan alone. What they might go to war with one another over is which of them ends up being the dominant power in the world's most prosperous and dynamic region. And Taiwan has become, thanks to decisions made in both Beijing and Washington, and decisions made over many decades, this is the most sensitive, not the only, but the most sensitive test for that question of relative position in the Asian order. If the US can compel China by the threat of war to leave Taiwan alone, then America will have reasserted its leadership in Asia. If China can compel America to let it take Taiwan without interfering, then China will have reasserted its leadership in East Asia. Now, this very difficult game they're both playing goes by the respectable name of deterrence. And deterrence did work during the Cold War. But it worked during the Cold War because both sides were very convinced of the other's resolve. The thing that's really striking about the Cold War face-off is that both in Washington and in Moscow, they clearly understood that if either of them crossed the dividing line between them, well, literally the line down the middle of Europe, for example, then the other side would be willing to fight a nuclear war to stop them. And that the worst moments of the Cold War were the ones where they started to doubt one another's resolve. But what happened in the Berlin crisis, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, is the conviction of that resolve was quickly reasserted by the actions of the other. Now, I think at the moment, deterrence, particularly deterrence of China by Washington, is weak. The US, the credibility of America's statements, ambiguous statements, that it will defend Taiwan, it is undercut by the fact that they haven't done what's necessary to build the forces to do it. It's very hard to persuade someone that you're going to fight a war that they know you can't win. And particularly if they know that you know that it might well go nuclear. And that's the problem. Now, that makes it easy for China to doubt America's resolve, and therefore to tempt the Chinese to call America's bluff. Now, how likely is that to happen? I'm not sure. There's an interesting debate to be had about that, but I do think it's a very real danger. And the consequences of that are very dangerous because the question is, well, is America bluffing or not? And the question is, I don't know. That's not what worries me. What worries me is, I don't think the Americans know. And that's a very dangerous situation. Because when the crisis hits, and the key decision makers meet at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is for some reason the way these things always pan out, facing one of the most momentous decisions any American president has ever faced, the question as to whether America's interests really warrant going to war over Taiwan, with the risk that that becomes a nuclear war with attacks on American cities, and what's really at stake for America, it's unlikely to get the sober, well-informed, patient, wisdom-infused decision that question requires. They're likely to get it wrong. Well, that all seems a long way from AUKUS. But I think, as I said at the outset, I think the question for us, I'll just speak for Australia, the question for Australia about whether we support AUKUS, whether we sign up to this, is really all about whether we think we should express our support the US approach to this question, which is so vital to our futures. That's much more important than whether Australia requires nuclear-powered submarines. Although that is a huge issue, and don't get me started because it's the stupidest thing we've ever tried to do. But it's much more important than that, and it's certainly more important than whether or not we actually sign up to collaborate with the United States on some advanced technologies. A central issue is whether we support and endorse America's approach to the future of Asia's order. Because, and it's worth bearing in mind, that's what AUKUS is all about for Washington. Washington doesn't really care whether Australia has nuclear-powered submarines. And it certainly doesn't care whether Australia joins in research into the force exotic technologies envisaged under Pillar 2. What Washington wants is our endorsement and a statement of our support. And that's one of the reasons why I think that AUKUS is, at least for Australia, a mistake. The other reason I think it's a dumb way of buying submarines, but I'll get into that. Now, that's not to say that I can't understand the appeal of, well, as we say in Australia, sticking by our mates. It's, the idea that what we do in the world is to stand with America, whatever America's doing, brackets even if it's a bit stupid, is pretty deeply embedded. When Scott Morrison announced AUKUS at 7 o'clock on the morning of the 17th of September a couple of years ago, he did refer to Britain and America as our forever partners. And the kind of, I can understand the intuitive appeal, but nothing is forever. And the epoch of our history in which that made sense as a smart way for Australia and perhaps also New Zealand to frame our approach to international affairs, to rely on our traditional mates that keep Asia safe for us, that moment's past. And keeping on doing that is just not doing justice to the scale of the choices we face. I can understand why people worry about an Asia in which predominant power and influence lies with Beijing or Delhi, or for that matter, Jakarta. This is going to be very difficult for us, but that is precisely why we need to really take the challenge of the future of the international order seriously and not just keep on hoping that somehow America's going to make it work for us. We shouldn't succumb to the illusion that America will save us. We should focus instead on doing whatever we can ourselves to help shape a new regional order, something like my second option, as close to our second option as we can get, working, of course, with other Asian partners, the countries we know are going to have a stake in this outcome, the Southeast Asians, the South Koreans, perhaps also the Japanese. And at the same time, preparing ourselves to make the best of whatever outcome emerges, including my scary outcome, where we don't end up with any kind of balance and we just find ourselves living in a region dominated by 2 or 3 Asian great powers. Now, I'm not as pessimistic as a lot of other people are about how that might work. And indeed, in the event in Wellington in a couple of days' time, that Hamish is very kindly indulging me to speak out, I'm going to talk a bit about that question. But what might that look like? But whatever it looks like, I think there's a lot we can each do to help frame the way the regional order evolves and to help prepare for whatever actually eventuates. And that's where our efforts ought to be going. And one thing I do think is clear is that as we do that, if we do that, the two of us will be drawn closer together. The differences that we've always had will still be there because they're embedded, as I said, in our history and our geography. But the forces that will drive us together as we're, so to speak, together alone in this part of the world will be stronger than ever. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Hugh. Ruben.
Okay.
Kia ora, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be a discussant for distinguished Professor Hugh White. I'm not sure what discussant's role is. Actually, I was more comfortable feeling myself as a bodyguard to Hugh White sitting there. But and I prepared some notes, and I'd like just to go through some of Hugh, your findings and suggestions. Where the first thing I would like to say is absolutely, I think there is no doubt that we're going through significant strategic shifts in the region and globally. You can't hear me?
Raise the volume a little bit, please.
Volume a little bit. How to add the volume a little bit?
No, it'll be on the.
No?
It's the mic.
How about now? Better now? Thank you. Actually, all our recent New Zealand strategic and defense policy statements have clearly emphasized the three shifts basically happening in the region and the world. So while we do have some tension points between New Zealand and Australia on various points, but I think strategically we are on the same frequency. Secondly, I absolutely agree with Professor White that any thoughts of containing China are absolutely unrealistic today. So I think we have to agree and stop denying the fact that China is here and that China will continue to be here and it gets stronger. At the same time, I don't think we will see America leave this region soon. I don't have that strategic capability to think many years ahead, but I don't think we will see America leaving this region soon or in a very long term. Because first off, America is part of this region. I mean, there was a term, as you remember, some defense officials of US were repeatedly reminding us that the United States is a resident power. And the United States is a resident power in this region, and as a resident power, it won't be leaving Hawaii, I'm sure, and other important destinations. And if America is not leaving, I don't see America getting too weak or not being able to balance. Even with the unknowns of the elections of the November 4th, I don't think Trump's isolationism will see less of America here. In case, actually, we can see more of a trade war unfolding, which will keep US very much involved in this debate. Absolutely, we need to diversify our foreign policy. When we think in New Zealand about diversifying, we're starting to think about diversifying our trade away from China, for example. But to me, foreign policy is more than trade, and a need to look beyond our strategic partners is imperative. I absolutely agree with you. And in fact, I do have a couple of issues with terms that have become like cliches, but not really well explained. What does it mean to be like-minded? We forge relationship with like-minded countries, but like-minded about what? Is it an ideological like-mindedness? Is it a case-by-case? Can we be like-minded with China on one thing and like-minded with the United States on another? Possibly. But we have these cliches in our foreign policy statements. Another one is a rules-based international order, and no one clearly states in any of our foreign policy documents what exactly we mean by rules-based, and why is that we protect rules-based and some other countries don't want the rules-based. Which rules are we talking about? And here's my bluff, kind of bottom line up front, is that absolutely AUKUS is a proxy for bigger debate. And I think we need a debate. We're starting to have some debate, and we even some signs of maybe losing the bipartisan agreement on some of our issues. Although, of course, the National Party presents this as a kind of a bipartisan thing. Labour started, we continue, we haven't decided yet. It's just a matter of interest. But I think the signs are there that we could eventually see a major evolution leading to a situation of the 80s, where we came up with a very dramatic decisions on the anti-nuclear policies. The problem we have is that, unlike Australia, we don't have a foreign policy strategy. We have MFED Strategic Intentions document, which is a bureaucratic document which has very narrow, and I apologize to some of my diplomatic colleagues from MFED. We just produced our first national security strategy, and I dare to say we produced that mostly and mainly in response to a Royal Commission recommendation, not because it's driven by a genuine desire and multi-agency pressure to come up with an umbrella national security strategy which clarifies some of these things, and the foreign policy strategy that actually is subordinate to that national security strategy. What we do is we release national security strategy and defense strategy on the same day with an hour difference. That's not how it's supposed to be. So we do have issues there, and so based on that, how do we approach AUKUS? Is AUKUS about building capabilities, or is it about containing China, or is it about deterring China? And by the way, the title of your presentation is "Can America Solve Our China Problem?" I hope you agree with the title, because some people in this country think that China is not our problem, it's America's problem. But China is our problem as well, but absolutely the way we respond to that could be very different from what people in Washington think, or even in Canberra think about that. So on deterrence, I don't know. I think Professor White, you took it too far to the nuclear element of it. But in my opinion, some deterrence approach could work with China, mostly emphasizing the price that China will have to pay for any decision that could risk stability in the region. And given China's very pragmatic, geoeconomically focused approach, I think a deterrence in that context could work. So the debate on AUKUS, I just want to refer to a very good article by Alex Gillespie from Waikato University. It's a 7-page, unbelievable, 7-page in North and South magazine. It's showing that there is some interest in foreign policy. He's urging us not to pick between the two, very polar perspectives on China, between paranoia and utopia. And I think there are signs that we are still navigating there. On the paranoia side, it's one thing to express concerns about South China Sea issues and China's kind of dismissive approach to legal perspective on South China issues, or weak fate of Uyghurs. The other thing is to basically deny China's helpful contribution to disaster management or infrastructure development. This is where I think we completely disagree with our Pacific Island partners. And when it comes to the other aspect of it, I think we still have that perspective that this assumption that we are dealing with a new Cold War between democracies and autocracies is a little bit kind of exaggerated approach. Our very popular former Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern very clearly said that it would be unwise to consider China as kind of a Russia-type country, because it's a completely different scenario, and that let's not push China into Russia's embrace in type of behavior. But I just want to let you know that there's been a book just published by Anne Applebaum. If you watch Fareed Zakaria's GPS, he interviewed her. She's a prize-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and expert on particularly authoritarian regimes. And she just published a book which is called Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. And it provides an alarming account of how autocracies work together to undermine the democratic world and how we should organize to defeat them. And this is what she says, if you allow me, I'm still within my 10 minutes. We think we know what an autocratic state looks like. There is an all-powerful leader at the top. He controls the police. The police threaten the people with violence. There are evil collaborators and maybe some brave dissidents. But in the 21st century, that bears little resemblance to reality. Nowadays, autocracies are underpinned not by one dictator, but by sophisticated networks composed of kleptocratic financial structures, surveillance technologies, and professional propagandists, all of which operate across multiple regimes, from China to Russia to Iran. Corrupt companies in one country do business with corrupt companies in another. The police in one country can arm and train the police in another. And propagandists share resources and themes, pounding home the same messages about the weakness of democracy and the evil of America. International condemnation and economic sanctions cannot move the autocrats. Even popular opposition movements from Venezuela to Hong Kong to Moscow don't stand a chance. The members of Autocracy Inc. aren't linked by a unifying ideology like communism, but rather a common desire for power, wealth, and impunity. So Russia and North Korea are building a military relationship is an example. Elections that were completely rigged in Venezuela, and we're reading that, and it's huge. The first reaction, who were the countries that immediately welcomed the victory of Maduro, was China and Russia. So I think, while not exaggerating this autocratic kind of solidarity, I think, in my opinion, we need to really appreciate that when we think China, it is not just a Beijing regime, a country that we trade with, but it is also an important player, some would say enabler of aggression of Russia in Ukraine. So, and the whole thing, if I may, this discussion of AUKUS, I'd like to draw some, it's not exact parallel, but the discussion about NATO expansion. Because we still, I don't think we have come to an agreement whether NATO expansion was the wrong thing, which triggered invasion by Russia of Ukraine, or was NATO expansion the right thing because Mr. Putin was going to invade anyway, and we better have a NATO with Finland and Sweden in the organization than that. So I think, and the final point I would like to make is, one suggestion that is made, if it's about capabilities, why join AUKUS? We can use other mechanisms that we have. The problem with other mechanisms also is that, as we know from the Five Eyes kind of participation, that oftentimes we are asked to do more than we are supposed to in an intelligent mechanism. So are we going to broaden our involvement with strategic partnerships, diversify it, or are we going to stay with the ones that we have? But the problem could be there that we will be asked to do things that we are not supposed to be doing within them. So, and my final plea is, I think it's time for New Zealand to be a little more proactive. I mean, we often know, we have a lot of trust in the region. We could be an honest broker. And oftentimes we don't do this because there is so-called risk. We are risk averse to, doing something that might endanger our trade, for example, or economic relations. To me, I think we're at the crossroads where not doing anything in more facilitation between some dialogues, even dialogue with China. I mean, why don't we talk with China about certain security issues of common interest? And New Zealand playing a more proactive role, I think, could help us really close this gap between our security interest in some countries and economic dependence on others. I think continuing this dichotomy is becoming more and more challenging, and we better do something else about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben.